Hi, everybody. My name is Julie Combs, and I'm a professor of educational leadership at Sam Houston State University. I've been a professor for about 16 years. I guess even longer than that because I was a professor before that as well. So I've been working with doctoral students on dissertations for many, many years and have taught the academic writing class to our students for a number of years. And because of that, I have had to learn APA really well. And so I've learned fourth edition, fifth edition, sixth edition, seventh edition, and I will tell you, it gets better each and every time. So today I'm going to share the workshop. Let me share my screen. APA 7th edition, the Big Ten. So you might have been interested in this workshop for a number of reasons. I hope to soon find out from you. So just to get started, just to tell you the goals of the workshop, to understand some of the changes from the 6th to the 7th edition, and then to talk with and students in particular who are trying to learn this APA stuff and just how does one go about doing that when it's such a massive book. And then for those of you who are teaching, how and what are some strategies to focus and help support your students, particularly when there's not much time in the classroom for APA instruction. And then finally, I've chosen 10 what I call rules or guidelines that if you don't have much time, I would start with these 10 as I see them most frequently used in the work that I grade. So to start with, I'd like you to think about which category best describes you today. And there could be more than one right answer for you, or maybe none of the above. But you've used 6th and you're transferring to 7th edition. Does that describe you? You're new to style manuals and you wonder, why are they important? You know that APA is important, but you struggle with applying the rules in your writing. To you, APA simply means in-text citations and reference list, i.e. lots of detail. And maybe there's another category that you don't fit. So if you just take a minute, which one of these best resonates with you and where you are today? And the good news is I hope to offer something today that addresses each of these categories and perhaps even the other. So to get started, I'd like to zoom in and zoom out of APA and just talk about it from a couple different viewpoints. So let's look at it from the forest standpoint. So if we were to step back, what is APA? So to me, as I thought about this and I reflected on all that I know about APA, a couple of keywords come to mind. The issue of respect, respect for other people's work, respect for other people and how we may refer to them in our writing, fairness in terms of how we divide up the work and also the credit for work, fairness in terms of giving other people credit for their work. So there's a couple of, I guess, guiding questions I would say when we're thinking about APA from a big picture. So can people find your sources? So you've cited some evidence in your writing, you have a reference list. Can they find that both in the text and in the resource or the reference list? Do you give proper credit to other people for their ideas or their direct words directly quoted? Do you respect people and how you write about them? And that is covered in the bias-free language chapter. Do you follow guidelines of evidence-based writing and research? Really important, does the reader know what you mean? Can they understand it? And just a segue to that, can an international reader understand some of your word choices? So these to me are the big picture of APA. It helps us deal with things like ethics, plagiarism, bias, respect, And then there's more of the details of APA. So as we zoom into APA, a lot of times this is what people think of it as in terms of all of these rules, all of these like little things that I have to follow in my writing. So these are some of the things that I've just listed here. Of course, there's many, many more, but the issue of formatting, do we use bold, do we use italics, when, that can be confusing. Punctuation, periods, commas, colons, dashes, all of those things that we use in language. The use of the and sign, when we use the abbreviation versus when we use the abbreviation at all. Tables and figure formatting. And then what are some of the details we need in a reference list? That has changed over each edition. Whereas, for example, today we rely on DOI numbers. Those weren't present 2 editions ago, at least they weren't mentioned. So as you're transitioning from 6th to 7th, this part of the presentation is specifically for you guys. So there is a really helpful in the manual, and I'll just make a plug. I really like the spiral version. You can't really see it because of my background, but you see these tabs. I really like that part about the new manual. And so there's an introduction section that outlines changes to each chapter. So if you are transitioning, I do feel like that's a helpful transition tool. Also, there's videos and resources. I've put the APA style website. There's a helpful blog on there. And then in this presentation today, I'm highlighting on specific changes from these specific chapters. So I'm not covering all the changes, but just what I consider some of the more used ones. So in chapter 2 is about the elements of a paper and the formatting of a paper. And in this version, APA addresses that sometimes we need a title page as a professional author, and sometimes we need a title page as a student. So they now offer 2 options, and those are listed on page 30. One thing that has changed is that the title of the paper is now in bold. It's still centered and it's still in title case. We no longer have to figure out how to use Microsoft Word to do a first page different header. So now we no longer use the term running head. We just put the header in all caps up in the header section of a Microsoft Word document with the page number to the right. And so that's really helpful in helping students get those papers set up correctly. Another thing really helpful is APA tried to address some confusion with the outline of headers, first level, second level, third level. And really helpful, I recommend to students, is to look at that example paper that is in that chapter 2. So, and as you notice on this PowerPoint, I'm not reading each and every point. I'm just making some highlights here, and then you can always come back later and look at these page numbers and these references for your use. Chapter 4 is about writing style and grammar, and these are a few changes from 6th edition to 7th. So APA provides some clarification on something called an anthropomorphism. And this is basically where we give a non-human thing human characteristics. And APA clarifies that sometimes they are acceptable as long as they don't mislead readers. So you might want to read this section a bit more for some of that clarification. I really like the table that provides clarification on verb tenses and which part of the manuscript and which verb tense we're to use. Just a reminder, anytime we're writing about past studies, i.e. in a literature review, we always use the past tense. Again, APA reminds us that first person, the use of I, the use of me, the use of we, if it's a group, is preferred over the third person, the researcher. APA gives us some guidance with passive voice and now says it's acceptable when it isn't important to know who performed the action. So sometimes it is acceptable to write in a passive voice because it can be difficult to avoid both anthropomorphisms and have an active voice. So sometimes that's really tricky in writing. So I like that clarification. And of course, with the gender, the use of they instead of he/she or he or she, particularly when it's not relevant as to gender or it's not known. And then just the general guideline, using they is inclusive of all people, and it helps us avoid making assumptions about gender. So that's one of the bigger picture guidelines of APA, is that use of bias-free language. Moving to chapter 6, which is mechanics of style. This chapter is just packed with detail after detail and all the little conventions or big conventions that are used in writing and how APA says to address those. For example, we now use one space after periods. So those of you that learn like I did on a typewriter, I get to break that habit of the two space with the thumb on the space bar. APA clarifies some use of the colon, the use of dashes and hyphens. And also there was confusion in the last edition about, well, when do I put something in quotation marks and when do I put it in italics? And of course, we have moved away from underlining. Quotation marks are primarily used for someone's direct words. That's the primary number one use. They can be used for slang expressions or labels. On the other hand, italics are used for anchors on a scale, or if you're defining the word, like you say, the term college readiness will be used in the study as, or will be defined in the study as, we would say the term college readiness is going to be in italics instead of quotation marks. And then there's lots of examples for the use of numbers, which happens to be one of those areas that both students and instructors really struggle with, is when do you use the number and when do you use the word? Additional changes in Chapter 8 for in-text citations. I really like how APA provides more clarification on the over-citation. So when are you citing too much and when are you not citing enough? So I really feel like that is good guidance for students. The one change that I personally really like is starting from the very first sentence, any study that has 3 or more authors, we always use the et al. So we use the first name, Smith, and then for all the others, we use et al. There's no comma between Smith and et al. It's just Smith, et, space, al, period, and then the date. And that goes throughout the whole paper. I really like that. That does save an editing step and checking for that first time use, particularly when you cut and paste and move things around in your paper. I also like how APA clarifies using primary sources to the extent possible, and to really try to avoid that as cited in secondary source use. So more, you can read more about that. And then one thing I really like is they've let go of some of the rigidity around how we type things. So ellipses now can be typed as ... or space. So I like that it clarified that for students. Lots of changes, of course, with references, as you might expect, particularly as things are more available online. Some of the rules have changed. So how a work was obtained, like if it's from a database, or when, such as the date it's retrieved, do not impact the reference information. So that's a really important clarification they made. When we have a reference with multiple authors, 10, 12, 15, we will write out all the names from the first author to the 20th. And then at that point, we'll handle it like the last edition did when we got to about the 9th author. Really like this, retrieval dates are not needed in most cases. I really like this one. In periodicals, we now include the issue number if the journal has an issue number. So all journals typically have volume numbers. That's the first number. In this example, that would be the 13 would be the volume number, but the issue number is the number in parentheses, the issue that's issued that year. And I really like how APA clarified that and just put, before in the 6th edition, they had this either or rule, really confusing for students, makes it much clearer and easier for us to find when we're looking for an issue in particular. They changed some things on books in regards to publishers. The names are still needed, but the city and state where something was published is no longer needed. There's some clarifications on DOIs and URLs. There's many changes. I would say the biggest one is how we format the DOI. The DOI needs to be formatted with this HTTPS and then two backslashes every single time. So one suggestion that APA makes is to copy and paste that DOI link into your paper so that it's not mistyped. But we no longer type in, like we did in 6th edition, DOI, lowercase, and then a colon, and then the number. We now put all of those in hyperlinks. So much more information in the manual about that. And then last, if a reference cannot be recovered, meaning you can no longer locate it, then it should not be in your paper, should not be in the reference list. And that can really be hard for people who have found something one time and they can't find it a few months later. So I always suggest making note of that URL that you're at, maybe the home web page, so that you could maybe find an item later when you're looking for it. So these highlight some of the changes from 6th edition to 7th edition. There are many others. I just wanted to point out what I consider the more used ones, particularly the ones that I think let students have a little bit easier time with having to wrangle with Microsoft Word and how to get it to do these different functions that sometimes take some advanced knowledge to do. So next I'm going to move into a section. So let's say that you're learning APA, or you're teaching APA. What are some things that you can do to make it easier for students, easier for yourself as you learn and teach? And so these are strategies that I've used in the classroom and that doctoral students find helpful. So one strategy, and these are not in any particular order, is to take the content of the manual and to divide it up into a self-study. Now, in one of my classes, this is part of the class, they do the self-study on the side, and I have a series of quizzes at the end of each one of these units that quizzes them over this information. It's set up as a self-study, so I don't spend a lot of class time on it, but I will answer questions that come up. And so what I've done here is just shared with you the outline that I use to work through the manual. Notice I don't start at the beginning. We jump right into how to set up your paper, very first thing, and then we move through details, and then we come back to the ethics. I feel like that's important because then students have more of a foundation to understand research. Remember, I teach them in the very first class, and so sometimes they come in with limited understandings about research studies, about what they are. And so I want to teach ethics with an understanding of that so that they can connect that with something they already know. So that's one strategy, is the self-study. Another strategy that we use in class is with some of the articles that we have, we just do a search for some of the applications of APA. And so these are just some examples. We might look and see, how did this author deal with the abbreviations, such as for the SAT, the ACT test, for a special program name. So we'll look at that and see how many abbreviations, how do they deal with it, how did they set that up. We'll look at the reference list. Do any of the references have DOI numbers, and how are those formatted? We might look at the beginning of the paper. Is there a section called the introduction? And then I'll discuss why there usually is not, because APA says not to in chapter 2. And then we'll find numbers that are used throughout the articles, and we'll look to see, are they written? Are they used as numbers? And just a note, if you are using manuscripts that are published in journals, just keep in mind that even if they are an APA formatted journal, they're not going to be 100% APA when we look at them, particularly tables and figures. And that's because the editor is going to have some different style guidelines. They're more concerned about white space, et cetera, et cetera. So just because we submit something APA doesn't mean that it's going to look like that in its final form once it's published. I just point that out to students because sometimes a journal might have a different way to handle numbers than, for example, APA. Just like our libraries sometimes have different rules around dissertations than our style guides might. Another strategy is to assign students or assign yourself a small chunk of a chapter, and then to make a one-page summary about that content. And so what I find is that students really learn the content well when they're asked to prepare a short presentation on that. We call these mini lessons. They prepare a 5-minute mini lesson on an assigned section. And then they prepare a one-page handout that also includes some practice items. So I'd like to share an example of that with you. And I will pull up a mini lesson that I wrote as an example. This is over chapter 2, the formatting, and then I put the sections that it covers. So I asked students to have a section called the concept, and this is just a 1 or 2 sentence description of what this mini lesson is primarily about. So this one is primarily about how to set up your paper. And then I asked them to look in the text and find essential learnings. And so sometimes you notice that there'll be page numbers and quotation marks. Sometimes there won't. There'll be directions. So notice on a title page, we do not put our title. Like if we have an EDD or an MA or whatever it is that we have, we don't put those distinctions on the title page. And we talk about why that is, so that students can understand some of the reasoning behind APA as well. The next section of the mini lesson is examples. And so I asked them to point out any helpful examples in the book. And then the last section is a practice section. So I asked them just to write a few quiz type questions where we could do together as a class and just practice, not many, 2 or 3, just so that they can practice that content. So this is an example of a mini lesson that covers the concept, the learning, and some examples. And this is really helpful when students are trying to remember a concept, as this contains usually some of the more important details about that concept. Okay, so that was the one-page summary. Either make that as an assignment for your students, or if you're a student doing a self-study, having one of those one-pagers for yourself would be really helpful. Okay, for the next strategy, this is something called a personalized editing checklist. And I got this idea from back when I was a 4th grade teacher and I taught young students how to write. And one of the strategies we learned was to, as you're trying to teach students editing and revision, and you're trying to teach them how to improve their work, give them a short checklist of items to look for. And so usually those would be like a format and then maybe a content item. So taking that idea, I give students in the doctoral program lots of feedback in their writing. And I ask them to take their first 4 assignments that are just full with track changes and to make a personalized editing checklist. So look over their errors, in particular, their errors. So we are focused on the errors here. And notice what maybe the mistakes, because as people, we tend to have patterns around our mistakes. We make the same ones typically over and over. And then to make a list of that called an editing checklist. And so here's just an example of one. Maybe I'm struggling with the use of et al. Maybe I'm not punctuating it correctly. Maybe I'm using the word since or the word while, and APA has some guidelines about using those words because they do have multiple meanings. It can be confusing to readers. Maybe I'm forgetting that Oxford comma and my sentences are confusing as to what are the elements in the sentence. Perhaps I did not abbreviate correctly, or sometimes I abbreviate the word and sometimes I don't. And then of course the numbers. Anytime there's a number used or not used, trying to decide if that's the exception, if that's the rule, and what should be. So this is an example of an editing checklist. I have another example of an editing checklist. I actually use this as an assignment in one of the classes I teach. I've explained it up here, but the students turn in their checklist from the first couple months, and then we look at their progress over time. And so this can be a really exciting method to track one's progress over time. For example, one of the errors I really struggled with as a younger writer was the use of who versus that. And so we use students who were in the study, and we use that for things like the schools that were in the study, because those are things. And so I just tended to use that for everything, and that was incorrect. So I learned how to do that, and then I could take that and who off of my editing checklist and learn some newer things. So I had some really strong mentors as a new professor, and those are some of the things that they helped me through their feedback. Next, I wanted to share another idea with you, and that is maybe to use some evidence-based information when you're learning APA. So the evidence for some of this that I'm about to share comes from a study that we conducted about 10 years ago, where we looked at about 70 manuscripts that were submitted to a journal, and we coded and then we themed the frequency errors. So we looked at their errors, their APA errors, and then we calculated frequency, we coded, we themed. So we used both a quant and a qual data analysis approach there. And these were the results of the themes of the most frequent errors in submitted manuscripts to one journal. So just wanted to share this in terms of like APA categories and themes. You'll notice pretty high on the list, number 5, in-text citations. And then of course, number 6, numbers and capitalization. So with that concept in mind, and of course I've graded many, many papers over the years, many dissertations, edited those. And so what I've come up with is what I call the top 10, the big 10 list of, if you only have time or you just want to get started and you're not sure where to start, look at these particular guidelines in APA, because more than any, these are going to be some of the ones that are the most used. And so there's 10 of these. So I'd like to talk to you about each one of these. The first one is learning the in-text citation and knowing that it has 2 parts, the last name of the authors and the year. And we should be able to find it exactly in your reference list by that author and that year. They should all align. They should be matched up. There are 2 formats to an in-text citation. They can be part of the narrative or part of the sentence, or they can be in parentheses somewhere in that sentence. And there's more guidelines in the book. In general, I teach students to use the author and date in every in-text citation. There are some exceptions, but what happens is they'll start cutting and pasting things, and then they'll violate one of the rules that says in any paragraph, you have to have the author and the date the first time a study is mentioned. So those are just some guidelines for number 1, in-text citations, learning about those. Number 2, the et al. Rule. So anytime there's 3 or more authors, we use the first author's name followed by et al. And I also ask students to focus on how that's punctuated, that it's not in italics, it's just et space al period. Number 3, big picture. So sometimes I find that students do not understand when they should cite. Some of them are under the impression that, and if they're not directly quoting somebody, then there's no need to cite. And so we have to talk about the differences between paraphrasing and direct quoting, and then of course plagiarizing. And both paraphrases and direct quotes require citations. So, and then the last sentence on this slide, good scholarly practice means that you find the primary source, you read it, and you cite it. rather than rely on a secondary source. So anytime my students find a study within a study, they really like it, they want to know more about it, I say, go find the study. In most cases, you can find the study with the resources that we have available to us with the internet and the library databases. Okay, moving on our list, number 4, learn the number rule. The basic rule is 9 and below are words, 10 and above are the number. There are many exceptions. Sorry to break that to you, but there are many. It would be helpful if you looked at some of those. Number 5 and 6 are word choice. And I just find these are commonly used words in writing that I read, and that is the use of while and since. So if you can substitute although, whereas, despite, and for the use of while, do so. In APA, it's reserved to mean actions occurring at the same time. This happened while this happened. And usually we would probably use that in the sense of a study if we were doing something at the same time. Similarly, the use of since means from a time in the past, since 1930. That's the correct use. If we can use because, then we do so, it's clearer. So we don't say since the boys came into the study. We say because they came into the study, we did this. So learning those two distinctions. Number 7, get the formatting set up. Get your Word document set up from the beginning. Double spaced, 1-inch margins, a legible font, and how to do title pages. And the good news with format is that Microsoft Word has a lot of defaults already programmed in. And in the older editions of APA, we had to go in and change a lot of the defaults in Microsoft Word. Now APA has become more lenient in some of these items, and we don't have to do as much with Microsoft Word to change it. So I think that's good news. Number 8, direct quotes. We use these sparingly, but when we do use them, and we usually use them for emphasis or to provide a definition from another author, we need 3 things in that sentence. We need the author's name, we need the year, and we need the page number where this quote came from. And then, of course, APA goes into detail about what we do if we don't have a page number. Number 9, the Oxford comma. Using that Oxford comma in a series of 3 or more items. There's examples on 155. And then number 10, abbreviations. We use abbreviations when considerable space can be saved, or the readers are familiar with the abbreviation. But writing is generally easier to understand when words are written out or abbreviations are not used. So that's just something to consider. Having a paper full of abbreviations becomes very difficult for a reader to remember what they are from the very beginning of a lengthy paper. The main thing is to be consistent. If you're going to use abbreviations, use them throughout and do not switch back and forth. So these are what I call the Big 10, or if you only have time for 10 rules, really try to master these. They will take you far in your writing. And to sum up today, we've talked about the big picture of APA, how it's more than the minutia, the small details, but it also represents respect, fairness, and ethical treatment of others. And then some teaching strategies that I suggested if you're learning or teaching APA. Divide up the content and make a self-study. Find articles and collect examples of APA applications. Make a 1-page summary for the chapter or a chunk of content. Create your own editing checklist. And master a list of these 10 concepts most commonly used, at least in my practice. So I hope that you've enjoyed this lesson, and I wish you well. Thank you so much.